In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus told the parable of a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, an enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat. The tare is said to be a type of weed known as the darnel. The darnel is sometimes called false wheat because as it grows, it appears almost exactly like the real wheat surrounding it. But as it nears the harvest, the wheat turns golden brown, but the darnel turns black, and its seeds are full of poison. Jesus said, "He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil." For nearly 2,000 years, the world has been turned upside down over what can only be called the most controversial book of all time. To its critics, the Bible is merely a combination of myth and legend mingled with history. But for those who believe in its sacred writings, it is the inspired and inerrant Word of God. A divine record that not only tells the way by which men get to heaven, but also warns of an eternal judgment for those who reject the light of truth found within. In the 19th century, a German scholar named Constantine von Tischendorf would publish what would become known as the most ancient biblical manuscript ever recovered. His discovery would turn the world of Bible scholarship upside down, convincing many that his manuscript was a lost version of the Bible. In his memoirs he wrote, "The desire which I felt to discover some precious remains of any manuscripts, more especially biblical, of a date which would carry us back to the early times of Christianity, was realized beyond my expectations. It was at the foot of Mount Sinai, in the convent of St. Catherine, that I discovered the pearl of all my researches." Tischendorf tells of how he discovered this manuscript in a trash basket inside the convent. The monks had been using its pages as fuel for the fire. He wrote, "I perceived in the middle of the great hall a large and wide basket full of old parchments, and the librarian told me that 2 heaps of papers like this had been already committed to the flames. What was my surprise to find amid this heap of papers a considerable number of sheets of a copy of the Old Testament in Greek, which seemed to me to be one of the most ancient that I had ever seen."
He's visiting the monastery in 1844, and he's under the patronage and sponsorship of Frederick Augustus, King of Saxony. And while he's there, he discovers an old manuscript in a rubbish basket, and they were basically using it as tinder to start fires.
According to his own testimony, once he recognized the manuscript for its ancient value, Tischendorf responded quickly and was able to rescue many of the pages from being burned. He wrote, "The authorities of the convent allowed me to possess myself of a third of these parchments, as they were destined for the fire. But I could not get them to yield up possession of the remainder. The too lively satisfaction which I had displayed had aroused their suspicions as to the value of this manuscript." In total, Tischendorf recovered some 43 pages. When he returned from his journey, he chose to publish the pages, but secretly. He wrote, "I did not divulge the name of the place where I had found it, in the hopes of returning and recovering the rest of the manuscript." So Tischendorf published his Old Testament portion of the Sinai Codex, but he continued to believe that the New Testament portion of the manuscript was probably still somewhere inside St. Catherine's Monastery. Then he says he returned again in 1853 and didn't find anything.
So he finally goes back, and in 1859 he's able to get, well, the remainder.
It was during Tischendorf's third journey to St. Catherine's Monastery in 1859 that he made his most famous discovery. Tischendorf says that he was taking a walk with the steward of the convent and that they returned to his room at some point. Well, they were talking about the Septuagint, and he says, "I too have read a Septuagint," meaning a Greek version of the Old Testament. So then he pulls out this bulky manuscript that was supposedly wrapped in red cloth, and he shows it to Tischendorf. Tischendorf wrote, "I unrolled the cover and discovered to my great surprise not only those very fragments which, 15 years before, I had taken out of the basket, but also other parts of the Old Testament and the New Testament complete. I knew that I held in my hand the most precious biblical treasure in existence, a document whose age and importance exceeded that of all the manuscripts which I had ever examined during 20 years of study on the subject." Tischendorf would transcribe and eventually publish the manuscript under the name Codex Sinaiticus.
In relationship to the Sinaiticus manuscript, it's republished by Kirsup Lake in the 1800s. In the Old Testament portion, you can see what appears to be even burn marks on some of the leaves that were recovered.
That almost looks like he pulled that right out of the fire, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. See, here's...
So this certainly confirms his story, or it seems to, that they were throwing these pages in the flames.
Yeah, well, they were using it like we use newspaper to start a fire. This was old, it was brittle, so made good to start a fire there in the cool mornings and evenings at the monastery.
Once Sinaiticus was fully published, Tischendorf became a world-famous scholar, practically overnight. Nearly all the courts of Europe showered honors and distinctions on him for his great discovery. So much so, said his son-in-law, that they could not all fit on one man's chest. Oxford and Cambridge universities honored him with their highest degrees. In the midst of all this, a copy of Sinaiticus was sent to the Pope, who wrote Tischendorf an autograph letter congratulating him. Tischendorf even mentioned how an old man of distinguished learning had said, "I would rather have discovered this Sinaitic manuscript than the Koh-i-Noor of the Queen of England." The Koh-i-Noor was the famed diamond of India that was in possession of the English throne. And it's interesting because that's exactly how Tischendorf described his manuscript, as a diamond, he says, in his possession. And for him it was. Because of the Codex Sinaiticus, Constantine von Tischendorf would go on to become one of the most famous men of the academic world, and perhaps the most celebrated paleographer of all time. But shortly after the work was published, it was challenged by a prominent expert in paleography. His name was Constantine Simonides.
Constantine Simonides is undoubtedly the forgotten link in the history of Codex Sinaiticus, and it's because he waged an open and a public debate against Tischendorf for about 4 years, arguing that Codex Sinaiticus was not an ancient manuscript.
Alexander von Humboldt declared that Simonides was an enigma. Others believed his understanding of ancient languages to be ingenious. A 19th century publication said of him, "Dr. Simonides is a Greek by birth, and he speaks and writes the classic language of his forefathers with fluency, purity, and elegance." From his uncle, Simonides thoroughly acquired the art of paleography and became so great a proficient therein that few surpass him either in the practice of it or in the diagnosis of manuscripts.
Simonides had quite a reputation in the 19th century. On the one hand, he was a respected paleographer, but on the other hand, he had kind of a cloak and dagger history and was looked upon as sort of a Greek Indiana Jones, involved not only with ancient manuscripts, but also fighting battles as a Greek patriot against the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which is an important part of understanding who he was. And then as a scholar, Simonides was equally in the thick of debates about ancient manuscripts. He had presented his work before kings, nobles, foreign ministers, diplomats. He'd sold a number of manuscripts to the British Museum and other prominent institutions in Europe. So he was involved in the highest levels of the academic world at that time.
Simonides owned a collection of more than 5,000 ancient manuscripts that he had partly inherited from his uncle. As he traveled across Europe, he presented these works at libraries and universities. Their content often sparked intense debate. Simonides' debates usually centered around the understanding of ancient languages, and he generally believed that his own knowledge was superior to those around him, although he did not have a reputation for arrogance. But while he was in Germany, he got into a vicious conflict with the scholars at the University of Leipzig, and it was there in 1855 that he made enemies with von Tischendorf. So now, years later, when he comes forward and questions Codex Sinaiticus, he does so as Tischendorf's old nemesis. Simonides claimed that Codex Sinaiticus was no ancient manuscript at all, but a modern work created by himself and 2 other Greeks in 1840. While Tischendorf was in the midst of enjoying his fame, the story of Simonides began to be published in the London newspapers.
Simonides!
Needless to say, Tischendorf was furious.
Schweinhund! Idiot!
What followed would be a public debate that would continue in a variety of London newspapers for the next 2 years. In July of 1861, a publication called the Literary Gazette reported that, "We understand that in literary circles a rumor prevails that the manuscript now publishing by the Russian government under the direction of Mr. Tischendorf